want them to understand that they do not understand. This is a great time to give it a voice.
For decades, Dr. Phil McGraw commanded the airwaves like a courtroom judge, delivering blunt truths and reshaping lives with his signature tough love. To millions, he was the trusted TV psychologist who exposed secrets, solved problems, and made broken families whole. But now, at 75, the man who once stood as America's voice of reason is living a reality that no one expected. The cameras have stopped rolling, the audience has vanished, and the empire he built has begun to crumble. Wealth, fame, and power, those things he once used to define his life, have turned into heavy chains of regret. The family he guided on air was nothing like the one behind closed doors. The legacy he wanted to leave has been clouded by controversy, lawsuits, and whispers of betrayal. And today, Dr. Phil lives in a silence so far removed from the roar of television glory that it almost feels tragic. This is the untold story of how Dr. Phil's life unraveled. Dr. Phil's story begins in the heart of Texas, where a boy named Philip Calvin McGraw grew up under the shadow of struggle and ambition. Born in 1950 in Vinita, Oklahoma, and raised mostly in Texas, Phil was no stranger to hardship. His father, an aspiring psychologist who never fully achieved his own professional dreams, became both an influence and a warning sign for the young Phil. From a young age, Phil displayed a sharp mind and an imposing presence. He excelled in sports, especially football, using his size and determination to carve out a place on the field. But even as he pursued athletics, something deeper stirred within him, the desire to command respect, to hold authority, and to be seen as a leader. After injuries ended his hopes of playing football at a higher level, Phil turned his attention to academics, eventually earning a PhD in clinical psychology. That degree wasn't just a piece of paper. To Phil, it was a ticket out of mediocrity, a chance to rise above the struggles his family had endured. But even in those early years, colleagues whispered about his methods. He wasn't the soft-spoken, patient therapist many expected. He was bold, brash, and confrontational. He pushed boundaries. He wanted results, and he didn't care if his style ruffled feathers along the way. That style would later define him. His big break came when he crossed paths with Oprah Winfrey in the 1990s. At the time, Oprah was entangled in a major legal battle, and Dr. Phil, through his consulting firm, helped her navigate the trial with his sharp psychological insights and direct strategies. Oprah was impressed. She invited him onto her show as a guest expert, and from the moment he stepped onto her stage, audiences were hooked. His booming voice, no-nonsense approach, and larger-than-life presence made him unlike any psychologist television had ever seen. Week after week, his segments became highlights, with viewers tuning in to watch him dismantle excuses and strip away denial with an authority that seemed almost unstoppable. By 2002, Oprah had given him her blessing to launch his own show. Dr. Phil exploded onto the daytime scene, quickly climbing the ratings and becoming a staple in millions of households. His brand was simple but powerful. Confront people with the truth, no matter how painful. Families aired their darkest secrets. Addicts were forced to face their demons. Troubled teens were sent to reform programs. To viewers, it was riveting television. To Phil, it was proof that his method worked. The empire grew rapidly. Books under his name sold millions of copies. He became a fixture on talk shows, in magazines, and on billboards across America. Speaking tours sold out. He was no longer just a psychologist, he was a cultural phenomenon. A household name who made psychology mainstream entertainment. But with every new milestone, something darker lingered beneath the surface. Critics argued that he wasn't practicing psychology at all, but performance. They questioned his ethics, pointing out that his license wasn't active in California, where he filmed. They accused him of turning people's pain into profit. Yet, none of it mattered to the millions who adored him. In their eyes, Dr. Phil was a savior who gave people the courage to confront truths they'd been running from for years. For over a decade, his show dominated ratings, and his influence reached beyond television. But like all meteoric rises, shadows followed closely behind. The higher he climbed, the further he had to fall. And behind the glitz of fame, the seeds of future tragedy were already being planted. As Dr. Phil's show dominated the airwaves and his brand expanded into books, speaking tours, and licensing deals, money poured in like a flood. At the height of his success, it was estimated that he was earning nearly $80 million a year, making him one of the highest-paid television personalities in the world. To the public, his life was a dream fulfilled. Mansions in Beverly Hills, sprawling ranches in Texas, luxury cars gleaming in his garages, and a lifestyle dripping with wealth. The man who had once grown up with financial struggles now lived in a world where even the smallest whim could be satisfied with the stroke of a pen. His home became as much a symbol as his television stage. Inside those walls were elaborate collections of artwork, rare antiques, and furnishings that seemed to shout success at every corner. Photographs of the estate published in magazines revealed surreal details: fireplaces carved from imported stone, chandeliers worth more than most people's homes, and a staircase that looked like it belonged in a palace rather than a family residence. To outsiders, this was proof that Dr. Phil had not only changed his own life, but had conquered the American dream. Yet behind those walls, money didn't bring happiness. In fact, it began to cage him. The burden of maintaining his empire grew heavier with every passing year. Critics whispered that his financial moves weren't always as sharp as his television persona suggested. Reports surfaced about questionable investments, expensive lawsuits, and settlements that drained his fortune. Maintaining multiple properties, funding business ventures, and sustaining the image of a man who had it all demanded more and more resources. He couldn't simply scale down, not when the world had been conditioned to see him as larger than life. Wealth, once his greatest armor, became a prison that required constant feeding. The irony was brutal. On stage, Dr. Phil told guests that happiness didn't come from material things, that self-worth had to come from within. But privately, he seemed trapped in the very cycle he warned others against. The empire had to keep growing, not because it was needed, but because shrinking felt like failure. Lawsuits only added to the strain. Several former guests and staff members pursued legal action, some claiming exploitation, others alleging mistreatment. Whether settled quietly or fought in court, these cases cost not only money, but also reputation. Every headline chipped away at the aura of invincibility he had built. And still, the spending continued. Lavish cars, exotic trips, the kind of indulgences that might momentarily distract from the gnawing reality that material wealth cannot shield a man from aging, regret, or loneliness. Neighbors and insiders claimed that despite his riches, Dr. Phil seemed restless, even unsatisfied. The shine of wealth dulled quickly when the applause of the audience wasn't echoing through his home. He lived in palaces, but they felt like fortresses. Fortresses that kept him as much imprisoned as they did protected. By the time he reached 75, the empire no longer carried the same glory. Yes, he still had wealth that most could only dream of, but the illusion was clear. Money had not freed him. Instead, it had tied him to an image he could never escape. It was an image that demanded perfection, even as the man himself began to crumble under the weight of age, controversy, and fading relevance. For a man who built his brand on telling others how to live their best lives, his own had become a cautionary tale. For years, Dr. Phil presented himself as the embodiment of family values. On camera, he often praised his wife Robin, a woman who became a fixture in the studio audience, sitting front row and flashing her famous smile at the end of every show. To millions of viewers, they seemed like the perfect couple, married since 1976, weathering fame together, unshakable in their loyalty. Their union became part of the brand, a living example of the stability he preached. But behind the polished facade, cracks began to show. Robin, who had dedicated decades of her life to supporting Phil's empire, reportedly felt increasingly sidelined by the machine of his career. Friends whispered that she often felt more like a prop than a partner, trotted out to reinforce the image of family unity while her own voice went unheard. The pressures of maintaining their public image weighed heavily, and though they appeared united on stage, insiders claim their private world was filled with silence, disagreements, and distance. Their two sons, Jay and Jordan, grew up in the shadow of their father's fame. Jay, the elder son, leaned into the family business, carving out a role as a television producer and media figure in his own right. But even his career was seen by some as an extension of his father's influence rather than his own merit. Jordan, the younger son, struggled under the pressure of expectations and headlines. Rumors of personal issues followed him for years, with tabloids highlighting alleged troubles that left the family scrambling to defend their image. To the outside world, the McGraws appeared picture-perfect, but privately, they were navigating the same storms that Phil once lectured guests about on his show: strained relationships, generational conflict, and the heavy toll of public scrutiny. The larger-than-life persona of Dr. Phil left little room for vulnerability at home. His style, so effective on stage, reportedly created tension within his family. Conversations felt like confrontations, and the line between husband, father, and television personality blurred until there was almost no distinction. Robin was said to have longed for a softer, more attentive partner, while his sons wanted a father who listened rather than lectured. But the man who spent decades telling others how to connect, to heal, and to love seemed unable to bring those lessons fully into his own household. By his mid-70s, the divide had become stark. Robin continued to make appearances, smiling dutifully, but whispers circulated that she lived largely apart from her husband's world. Some insiders claimed the couple maintained separate lives under one roof, a quiet truce to avoid public scandal. The sons, now adults, were distant, not estranged, but far removed from the close-knit family Dr. Phil once painted on air. The McGraw home, filled with wealth and luxury, was reportedly devoid of the laughter and warmth that defined a true family. The tragedy was undeniable. The man who turned other people's family breakdowns into television spectacle was left to watch his own family fray in slow motion. Every staged smile and public handhold only emphasized the distance that had grown in private. And as Dr. Phil aged, the silence within his home became louder than the applause that had once fueled his every step. For every fan who praised Dr. Phil as a savior, there was a critic who saw something darker. His empire, built on the spectacle of human suffering, eventually became the target of relentless scrutiny. From the earliest days of his show, mental health professionals questioned his methods, arguing that what he offered wasn't therapy at all, but entertainment dressed in the language of psychology. They pointed out that he didn't practice in a clinical setting, that his license wasn't active in California, and that his on-air confrontations were more about ratings than true healing. Yet, the criticism didn't stop there. As the years passed, former guests stepped forward with troubling claims. Some said they were manipulated into appearing, promised help, but instead subjected to public humiliation. Others alleged they were left worse off after the cameras stopped rolling, with little follow-up care or support. The most explosive allegations came from staff members who painted a picture of a toxic work environment behind the glossy daytime stage. They spoke of long hours, intense pressure, and a culture where fear reigned. Some claimed producers pushed vulnerable guests into extreme emotional states just to create dramatic television moments, regardless of the damage it caused. Investigations by major publications began to chip away at his image. Reports alleged that addiction interventions were staged more for shock value than genuine recovery. That troubled teens were shipped off to so-called reform programs where conditions were questionable at best and abusive at worst. The man who lectured others about accountability now faced accusations that he had built a business on exploiting the vulnerable. Lawsuits only amplified the noise. Former employees filed legal actions alleging mistreatment. Guests accused him of negligence. Each case, whether dismissed, settled, or dragged through the courts, became another crack in the once impenetrable armor of Dr. Phil's reputation. Tabloids splashed sensational headlines across their covers. And even mainstream outlets began to question whether the empire had always been built on shaky ground. His critics were merciless. They called him a showman, masquerading as a healer, a profiteer of pain. They argued that he blurred the line between therapy and television so completely that what unfolded on his stage was not help, but exploitation. And while millions continued to watch, the perception began to shift. The aura of invincibility faded, replaced by suspicion. For Dr. Phil, the sting wasn't just in the headlines, but in the silence of professional peers who rarely came to his defense. Within the world of psychology, he was increasingly isolated, viewed not as a pioneer, but as a cautionary tale of what happens when credibility is traded for celebrity. At 75, the weight of these criticisms loomed large. His legacy, once defined by his rise to fame, now carried the heavy stain of scandal. The tragedy was not just that he had been accused, but that many believed the accusations fit perfectly with the empire he had built. A man who had made millions by confronting others with the truth was now confronted by the harshest truth of all: that the empire he had dedicated his life to had been tainted by the very practices he swore to stand against. For years, Dr. Phil was untouchable. His show was a ratings juggernaut, syndicated in countless markets, and his face was as familiar in American households as morning coffee. At its peak, Dr. Phil pulled in millions of viewers daily, shaping conversations at dinner tables and water coolers across the country. But television is unforgiving, and even the brightest stars cannot outshine time forever. As the landscape of daytime TV shifted, Dr. Phil's audience began to dwindle. Younger generations were turning away from traditional television, choosing streaming platforms and social media influencers over syndicated talk shows. The once captive daytime audience of stay-at-home parents and retirees fragmented into smaller, distracted pockets. Ratings slipped year after year. Advertisers, once eager to attach their brands to his empire, grew cautious. His formula, which had seemed groundbreaking in 2002, started to feel repetitive 2 decades later. Guests cried, families shouted, addicts begged for help. It was a spectacle viewers had seen too many times. What once shocked now felt scripted, predictable, even tired. industry insiders began to whisper that the era of Dr. Phil was over. But the decline wasn't just about numbers. Controversy continued to swirl, and networks grew weary of defending a host who had become a magnet for bad press. Allegations of toxic work environments, questionable practices, and exploitative storylines made executives nervous. Sponsors feared the backlash of being associated with a brand that no longer carried the sheen of credibility. For Dr. Phil himself, the slow decline was devastating. He had built his identity on being at the center of attention, on commanding the stage and the audience's gaze. Without the show, what was he? Colleagues described him as restless, increasingly bitter, and obsessed with maintaining relevance. He tried to pivot, appearing on podcasts, launching digital projects, even attempting to adapt his style for newer platforms. But none of it landed with the same impact. The audience that once adored him had moved on, and the younger generation barely knew his name. The final blow came when CBS announced that Dr. Phil would end after more than 2 decades on the air. The news was spun publicly as a graceful exit, a choice by Phil himself to pursue new opportunities. But behind the scenes, the truth was far more painful. The network was done. Ratings were too low, controversies too many, and the once golden brand had tarnished beyond repair. On the last day of filming, Dr. Phil walked out to applause one final time. Cameras captured his familiar smile, his booming voice, his practiced authority. But those who watched closely saw the weight in his eyes. For the first time in over 20 years, he faced a future without the stage that had defined him. The studio lights dimmed, the set was dismantled, and the man who had lived in the glare of constant attention was suddenly thrust into silence. For most, retirement might bring peace. For Dr. Phil, it brought a void. He had spent decades telling others who they were, what they should do, and how they should change. But when the cameras stopped, he was forced to face a chilling question he had avoided his entire life. Who was he without the show? The fall from television was not just the end of a program, it was the collapse of an identity. And at 75, it left Dr. Phil standing in the ruins of a world that once revolved around him, staring into a silence louder than any ratings chart could measure. The cameras had always been kind to Dr. Phil. His towering frame, his booming voice, and his stern yet comforting presence gave him an aura of authority that audiences trusted for decades. But time is ruthless, and even men who appear larger than life cannot escape its grip. At 75, Dr. Phil faces a reality no amount of wealth, fame, or bravado can disguise: the slow, steady toll of aging. Those who saw him daily on television began to notice subtle changes long before his show ended. His posture stiffened, his movements slowed, and the sharpness of his delivery sometimes gave way to fatigue. Behind the polished exterior, whispers of health concerns grew louder. Stress had weighed heavily on him for decades. The endless cycle of filming, managing an empire, facing lawsuits, and defending his reputation had carved deep lines across his face. Insiders suggested that his blood pressure, heart health, and overall vitality had all been compromised by years of unrelenting pressure. The man who once strode confidently across his stage now reportedly spent long stretches at home, conserving energy, avoiding the public eye. And while he still projected strength when necessary, in private, he was said to be far more fragile than he let on. Age has a way of humbling even the most powerful. For Dr. Phil, whose career thrived on presenting solutions, the greatest problem became one he couldn't solve: his own decline. Health scares, both real and rumored, painted a picture of a man no longer in full command of his body. He had always told his guests that denial was the enemy of progress, but those close to him whispered that he lived in denial about his own limitations. Exercise routines became less consistent. Once proud of his physical presence, he now struggled with fatigue. The mirror, once a friend that reflected authority and confidence, now revealed thinning hair, sagging skin, and a face marked by years of stress. More troubling, the mental toll of aging weighed just as heavily. Without the constant distraction of work, Dr. Phil was forced to sit with thoughts he had long pushed aside. Regrets surfaced about family, about choices, about the empire that had brought him both fortune and infamy. At times, his voice, once commanding, carried a note of bitterness, as though the world had moved on too quickly and left him behind. For decades, he had been the man who told others to face reality. Now, he was confronted with the hardest reality of all, that time spares no one. And unlike his guests, who could lean on his advice, he had no one to guide him through the twilight of his own life. Each passing year marked not just the loss of vitality, but the erosion of the identity he had clung to for so long. Aging, in its quiet cruelty, stripped away the stage, the power, the image, until only the man remained. For Dr. Phil, that man was increasingly frail, increasingly isolated, and increasingly aware that his most difficult battle was not against critics or scandals, but against the inevitable march of time. For decades, Dr. Phil thrived on the sound of applause, the roar of an audience, the intensity of confrontation, the energy of the cameras. All of it fueled his identity. But when the show ended and the spotlight faded, what remained was not peace, but silence. At 75, that silence has become his constant companion, and it is deafening. His mansions, once filled with guests, staff, and the hum of constant activity, now stand as monuments to emptiness. Neighbors in Beverly Hills describe a man who rarely steps outside, whose appearances in public have grown increasingly rare. The smile that once beamed at millions from television screens is seldom seen, replaced instead by a solemn, distant expression that betrays the weight of isolation. Friends who once surrounded him drifted away. Some were swallowed by their own lives, others pulled back when the scandals grew too loud. The celebrity circles he once moved in quietly shut their doors, wary of associating with a man whose reputation no longer brought prestige. Even within his own family, the bonds weakened. Robin, though still present in the public eye, is said to live largely apart from him emotionally. Her appearances with Phil more a performance of unity than a reflection of reality. His sons, now grown, live their own lives at a distance, carving out identities far from their father's shadow. For Dr. Phil, the home that once represented success has become a gilded cage. Surrounded by wealth yet starved for connection, he spends long stretches in solitude. The vast halls echo with memories of what once was: filming schedules, phone calls, planning sessions, the constant noise of an empire in motion. Now, those echoes only emphasize how quiet his world has become. Without the cameras to keep him occupied, he is left alone with thoughts he once drowned in work. Regrets haunt him. Choices replay endlessly in his mind. Guests who claimed they were harmed, scandals that could have been avoided, words he wished he hadn't said. For a man who built his life dissecting the mistakes of others, reflecting on his own has proven almost unbearable. Isolation also amplifies aging. With few distractions, he feels every ache, every reminder of time's advance. Where once he could bury himself in the adrenaline of television, now there are long hours of stillness, where frailty feels more pronounced. It is in these moments, insiders say, that he looks truly lost, a shadow of the man who once commanded millions. The tragedy is sharp. Dr. Phil, who told countless guests that healing comes from connection, finds himself cut off from genuine connection. He urged others to strengthen their families, yet his own feels fractured. He told addicts that isolation was poison, yet he drinks that poison daily in the quiet of his mansion. To the public, he remains a figure of authority, frozen in reruns and headlines. But in reality, his life has shrunk into one of distance and solitude. The man who once filled a stage now struggles to fill the hours of his day. For Dr. Phil, isolation is not just a circumstance. It has become his defining reality. The story of Dr. Phil is one of extraordinary rise and devastating decline. For over 2 decades, he was more than a television host. He was a cultural authority, a man millions trusted with their deepest secrets. His booming voice, commanding presence, and direct style made him feel larger than life, almost untouchable. Yet now, at 75, the reality of his life is far from the empire he once controlled. It is a reality steeped in regret, isolation, and the haunting realization that the very tools he used to build his career were not enough to save him from himself. His wealth, once a symbol of victory, has become a hollow monument. The sprawling mansions, the luxury cars, the priceless collections, these things remain, but they bring little comfort. Behind closed doors, opulence does not silence loneliness. They only magnify it, turning quiet hallways into reminders of how empty life has become. He lives surrounded by symbols of success, yet stripped of the joy and connection that make success meaningful. Family, the very foundation of his public persona, has fractured. Robin still appears when necessary, smiling for cameras, but those close to the couple suggest their marriage has long existed in name more than in truth. His sons, now grown men, keep their distance, carrying the weight of being raised under the shadow of a man who was both a father and a brand. What once looked like a picture-perfect family has, over time, revealed itself as carefully managed optics, masking an undercurrent of tension and emotional distance. Professionally, his reputation is scarred beyond repair. Once introduced as America's psychologist, he now carries the baggage of lawsuits, investigations, and public accusations of exploitation. Former staff members and guests painted him not as a healer, but as a manipulator, someone who profited from vulnerability rather than protecting it. For every story of someone helped, there is another of someone left worse off. Their pain turned into entertainment. His show's end was not a graceful retirement, but a forced retreat. The networks and audiences alike ready to move on from a figure whose methods no longer fit the moment. The health challenges only deepen the tragedy. Age spares no one, not even men who seemed invincible on stage. The once powerful voice trembles now. The commanding stride has slowed. Stress and years of carrying the weight of a public empire have carved deep scars into his body and mind. He lives with the constant reminder that his influence is fading while his fragility grows. The man who once defined himself as the answer to others' problems is now surrounded by questions he cannot answer. What is left when the spotlight goes out? Who is he without the cameras? The silence has not been kind. Isolation has become his most consistent companion. Once surrounded by applause, producers, guests, and an audience eager for his words, Dr. Phil now finds himself in the company of empty rooms. Friends drifted away, colleagues turned their backs, and the world at large has moved on. Social media teems with new voices, new faces, new gurus offering life advice. leaving him behind as a relic of another era. What remains is a man who once stood at the top of the world, now staring at the long shadow of his own legacy. His story is tragic, not because he lost his fame. Fame is fleeting for everyone, but because of the irony embedded in his downfall. Dr. Phil spent decades preaching the importance of accountability, family, and connection. Yet, in the end, he is left isolated, estranged, and struggling with the very demons he urged others to confront. His empire did not collapse with a bang, but with a quiet unraveling, leaving him to face a life that feels more like a cautionary tale than a victory lap. The tragedy of Dr. Phil at 75 is not just about wealth without happiness, or fame without legacy. It is about the cruel reminder that even those who dedicate their lives to advising others are not immune to the failings of their own humanity. And as he sits in the silence of his twilight years, surrounded by the ruins of a once mighty empire, one truth remains undeniable. The man who built a career exposing the flaws of others is now defined by the flaws he could never fix within himself.